Over the years, I've shared a lot of different iterations and experiments in creating living walls and deer blocking systems. In fact, I'm standing next to one here. This is just to the north of the barn that we've been working on in the woods. This one's pretty thorough and thick. It's old orchard fencing attached to metal T-posts that were pounded in, and then dead miscanthus stalks woven through like a basket. That's about 10 feet tall and more or less 100% deer proof at this point. But that is a lot of work to do on the boundary of an entire 6 acres. So we've modified that work a little bit, created something a little less intense, but still seemingly very functional in blocking deer. This is the northern boundary of our 6-acre property and goes down the line there. This is the last main pathway before the property line, and that's our last chance to kind of keep deer out of this space on the northern line. And one pattern that we've been working with, we started with this idea. We pounded in metal T-posts and ran 2 or 3 lines of 14 gauge wire at about 12 to 18 inches, 3 feet, 4 or 5 feet. Now, if it was just a T-post at that height, shorter than I am, with 3 metal wires in a broad open field, there'd be absolutely no way it would keep deer from jumping. But what we've been finding is that against this northern wall, so again you can see another T-post right in there, on the other side, on the north side, the outside so to speak, it's about 8 feet, almost 10 feet of solid Japanese honeysuckle, European buckthorn. There's vines woven through, and so that with the metal fencing in front seems to be a pretty formidable barrier for them. There's some parts of the boundary that the brush wall that we laid up, the original design of debris wall, are thick enough and solid enough that we've never seen deer jump through, and I suspect they won't be able to really get through. This is about 8 to 10 feet wide of debris that comes up to about my head height, so about 6 feet tall, 6 to 8 feet wide or deep, and deer cannot seem to get through that. And so on our side of brush walls like this, we've been adding trees. There's redbud, there is spice bush in here, more redbud, and so we can be cutting these back, pollarding them, weaving them in, and creating a green layer, a woody green layer on the inside. And we can just keep throwing debris on the other side. And for certain areas where we have lots of old woody debris, in fact, this is a decaying or dying white pine grove, and so there's a lot of deadfall in here that we clean up each year. And so that makes for a really easy way to renew and thicken this wall. So with no actual metal fencing, this has worked pretty well. Then we get into the real, this is the most recent part of our fencing work, and this is what now flanks around the majority of the land here. I got a hold of these 8-foot metal T-posts. These are old military posts. Somebody, I guess, was cleaning up an old military depot, and they had hundreds of them. They sold them to me for $5 a piece, and I got a massive 35-pound post pounder. These are really, really hard to slam in. But we took 8-foot posts and drove them down in 3 feet. So they're 5 feet above ground, and we ran 3 really taut lines of 14 gauge. So it's like that first set of metal fencing I was showing before, but drawn way more taut. And this, in conjunction with the brush wall, has been doing a really nice job, and it frames the boundary of the property in a really sweet way. It's visually not too intense, but seems to be quite functional. There are some areas like this where our neighbor's lawn to the north is really open and easy for deer to come up and navigate, so we'll need to thicken this quite a bit more. But the plan for doing that is, rather than bringing just debris all the time, now we've got these incredibly stout, long-lived metal posts and taut drawn 14 gauge wire at a regular interval. We've been starting to plant vining crops at the base of these posts. So we've added some grapes. I think in here I'll add hardy kiwi. Maybe we'll do hops, maybe we'll do schisandra, and have an additional vining layer that can be splayed across this metal fencing to really thicken it up. Again, in spots like this where now there's metal fencing facing our side that we can weave into. And then there's just so much brush, dead debris, but then also plants growing through it. Between the grapes and the river locust and the honeysuckle, we can prune that back and throw it back on the pile, keep it rounded over, and there'll be dense woody material with a beautiful growing green crown over it. And again, more opportunity for us to plant on the inside here to keep thickening and strengthening what this living wall with a little bit of metal can do for us. I like the look of it insofar as it barely having much of a look. You can kind of barely detect it until you're right up next to it. There's some spots in here. This is the corner, the northeast corner of the property. And in here, used to be a major corridor where deer were coming through. And so what I did is on the outside of this, in the brush pile out there, is I took some scraps of old fencing that we found and threw that into the mix. It's a really informal layer here, but this will allow the shrubs that are out there. There's a bunch of privet and oriental bittersweet, tough competitors, tough gnarly characters in other scenarios, but definitely allies in weaving a dense wall. And you can see the bittersweet's already running through this old metal fencing. So it's chaotic. It'll be minimal management ability in this brush pile in here, but it should just get thicker and thicker every single year and keep the deer out pretty solidly, and also make a lot of privacy for us. This line's been planted out somewhat thoroughly with goji berries. Well, there's thimbleberries that are already here, but we just ran this wire this spring, and throughout underneath the middle of the wire, we have gojis added in that can be trellised or espaliered on this. And then, like I mentioned before, we've added in cultivar grapes at the post. So we're going to train the grapes up the post and across, and have the goji woven through as a nice additional layer. We actually decided this particular part of the run based on an old gooseberry line that was in here, that still is here. And so now these gooseberries that have been growing here for a number of years can be brought across the line and woven just a little bit. Ay, goosey, you are spiky. And we can do that with the gooseberries and thicken up this wall and make a nice spiky wall of fruit with some plants that were already here. Let me know what kind of questions you have, or concerns, or interest in knowing more about this fencing method. I want to be really clear. If I were to just set this up, like I mentioned before, if we just had a tightly mowed many acres and I were to put that fencing and there's no vegetation around it, I could not imagine for a second it would keep deer out. But having so much brush and debris that's been there for years and years, and then this additional layer as a framework for the physical infrastructure of vines and vining type plants, I think should be a really great set of elements to keep the deer out in a real way and keep them out more each year. I bought the metal posts for $5 a piece, and we put them every 20 feet across the full boundary, the full 6 acres of this property. I think we used about 40 for this, and then we used about 2,000 or 3,000 feet of 14 gauge wire to lay out the 3 lines in between each of those posts. I'll crunch the numbers and put it on the screen as to what it actually cost us, but since the posts were used and we're not using tons and tons of wire or orchard fencing, I think this came in at a pretty decent deal for what it can offer this landscape. The goal in framing out a fence line like this is not to keep out deer absolutely forever and ever and ever. I think more than anything, it's about creating a little bit of a tree sanctuary in this landscape on the inside for just a few more years. We've been planting about 100 trees every spring or fall, sometimes end, for the last bunch of years, and the deer browse has just been unending, and we can't really afford the time or money to buy fencing for every tree. So the idea is to keep them out for a couple of years, get the interior of this landscape way more established and up above the deer, and then let them back in. In fact, there was a corridor that the deer really enjoyed that I was observing. This is the main place that they were coming in before we put this fence up, which is right through over there. And so we pounded 2 posts a few feet apart from each other and put in this loop of old fencing wire here, orchard fencing. And it's hooked on in a way where at some point, if we want, well, I got to do some pruning and stuff, but we could either take that out or just move it aside, and then it becomes an aperture for the deer to come back through, or for us to get on the other side to do maintenance if we get permission from our neighbor to do that, or have a way of knowing that deer are coming in, be able to close this and potentially hunt them inside this space if we needed to do that. It wouldn't be our intention to do that as a default, but it holds the option for sure. There's a long rambling look at just some of the new fencing that went up this season in the spirit of giving some protection and relief to all these cool characters that are throughout the landscape. We got oaks and hazelnuts and hickory and chestnuts and all sorts of berries and things that it would just be nice for them to get a break. And the deer, luckily around here, there's lots of old farm fields, there's woods, so I don't think they certainly like being in here. They like the novelty of all the different foods that they can eat. But I don't think we're going to be creating a really harsh, perilous scenario by them not being in this particular 6 acres for a few years. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what thoughts you got, and take care.